On the night she was supposed to begin her fairy tale, Claire caught her groom with her bridesmaid and vanished. 5 years later, she's rebuilt her life, her heart, and her family, but not without a fight. This is a powerful story of betrayal, resilience, and finding real love when everything seemed lost. You won't believe how it ends. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that move your heart and soul. Claire Harwood stood in front of the antique mirror in the bridal suite, barely recognizing the reflection staring back. The woman in the mirror wore elegance like armor, her raven hair twisted into a soft, sweeping bun, pinned with tiny white blossoms. Her ivory wedding dress clung to her curves with quiet grace, and her lips, glossed in rosewood pink, curved into a rehearsed smile. But beneath the surface shimmered a secret, one that pulsed quietly beneath her ribcage and fluttered just beneath her palm as she rested her hand on her still flat stomach. 7 weeks along. It had been a miracle, really. She and Richard had whispered about the baby 2 nights ago under silk sheets and champagne laughter. His reaction then had been carefully curated, tender, awestruck, promising. But that was Richard Wakefield. Everything about him, from his precisely combed sandy hair to his curated career in luxury finance, was finely tuned for optics. And yet, Claire had let herself believe. At 32, she'd spent enough time around pretense to recognize the real thing when she felt it. Or so she'd thought. The wedding coordinator chirped through the suite door. 10 minutes, Mrs. Wakefield. And Claire felt a small jolt hearing her new name. She barely had time to let it settle. The halls of the historic Charleston estate buzzed below with laughter, crystal clinks, and piano music as guests took their seats. The smell of magnolias and expensive champagne seeped in through the crack in the door. Claire gave herself one final glance, touched the silk bodice of her gown, where her child nestled quietly, and slipped out into the corridor. She needed a moment with Richard, just the two of them, to anchor herself, to breathe him in and feel the weight of this decision settle as joy, not performance. She walked slowly down the wide hall, heels soft against the hardwood floor. The master suite door was ajar at the far end. Yellow light pooled through the crack, painting a sliver of warmth across the floor. She approached, her fingers brushing the brass doorknob. Then she heard it. A laugh. High, feminine, familiar. Alyssa. Then Richard's voice, low and indulgent. Not the charming tone he used with reporters or board members, but the private one. The one Claire had once believed was reserved just for her. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and time began to bend. Inside, Richard stood, his tuxedo jacket discarded on the floor like it meant nothing. His hands were tangled in Alyssa's auburn curls as he pressed her against the marble counter of the ensuite bathroom. Alyssa's green bridesmaid gown was wrinkled and hitched halfway up her thighs. Their mouths were red-smeared, their eyes half-lidded and oblivious. Claire didn't scream, didn't cry. She simply watched. She noted everything in the cold, sharp stillness of heartbreak. The lipstick on his collar. Her lipstick, the one Claire had helped Alyssa pick out last week. The curve of his smile, identical to the one he'd given Claire just that morning. The wedding band he wore, his family's platinum heirloom, flashing mockingly under the overhead lights. Neither of them noticed her. Not at first. When they did, Alyssa gasped and scrambled backward. Richard straightened, breathless and half-laughing, until he saw Claire's eyes. Wide, dark, empty. Then he froze. But Claire was already turning. She walked backward, retracing her steps, her movements strangely calm. Her heels didn't echo now. The soft carpet caught every step as if the house itself were shielding her. Her hand, unconsciously, cradled her belly. That small life, that fragile promise, was suddenly the only thing that felt real. 300 guests waited below, sipping champagne in her honor. Her parents had spent a small fortune on the ceremony. The orchestra was tuning for their first dance. Her mother had cried during the vows. And yet, Claire Harwood, no longer Wakefield, not even for an hour, turned down a side hall, through the kitchen, and out into the staff parking lot. The crisp February air slapped her cheeks. She found her car, her own, not the chauffeured sedan waiting out front. Her honeymoon bag was still in the trunk. She hadn't had time to move it into the suite. A small mercy. She slid into the driver's seat, started the ignition, and pulled away. No fanfare. No announcements. just the quiet hum of tires on asphalt. In the rearview mirror, the estate glowed golden and perfect, a temple of lies. Inside, a man crafted to impress the world stood stunned, abandoned. The guests were still clinking glasses. Someone would notice soon. But not yet. Claire turned onto the interstate without a destination in mind. Her hands gripped the wheel harder than necessary. Her heart hadn't broken, it had hardened. The soft love she'd clung to had shattered, but beneath it, something tougher emerged. She passed the city limits as the night swallowed the road. Charleston disappeared behind her like a fever dream. She drove north, following nothing but instinct and highway signs. Past Columbia, past Charlotte, the dark cradle of the road carried her deeper into the unknown. She stopped only once, at a rest stop near Roanoke, to buy gas and a black coffee she barely drank. By dawn, frost laced the windshield and her legs ached from the long drive. She pulled into a small Virginia town she didn't know the name of yet. The kind of place where people smiled at strangers and stores closed on Sundays. She found a modest extended-stay hotel tucked behind a diner, paid for 2 weeks up front in cash, gave them her maiden name, Claire Harwood. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the bed, scrolling through the new phone she'd bought in a drugstore outside Richmond. No contacts, no missed calls. She hadn't plugged the old one in. She didn't want to hear Richard's voice. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She opened her laptop and stared at her bank balance. Still enough to get by for a few months. She had left behind a career as a project manager, a resume full of credentials, and a life polished for show. Richard had convinced her to quit 6 months ago to focus on their future. That future was ash now, but she still had herself. Her hand found her belly again. A habit now, a promise. "I don't know what we're doing," she whispered, "but we're not going back." Outside the window, the early sun spilled over the sleepy streets. The light didn't feel sharp here, it felt honest. Claire watched it rise until her eyes burned. Then she closed the laptop, placed both hands gently over her abdomen, and whispered again, quieter this time. "We're going to be okay." It wasn't a vow. Not yet. But it was the first step. Ashridge wasn't on any of the top relocation lists Claire had skimmed during the long hours at rest stops. It didn't boast big job markets or trendy food scenes. But when she took the exit and drove past the quiet main street, lined with red brick buildings, oak trees draped in early spring mist, and a library with an old-fashioned bell tower, she felt something settle inside her. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was distance. Distance from Charleston, from Richard, from betrayal dressed in satin and pearls. The hotel clerk, a kind woman named Judy, handed Claire a brass room key with the number 207 etched into it. Claire thanked her, keeping her voice low, and carried her bag up the narrow stairs to the room. It wasn't much, a queen bed, a kitchenette, a small desk, but it was clean. More importantly, it was anonymous. The first 2 days passed in quiet, methodical motion. Claire unpacked only what she needed. She applied for a new phone plan under her maiden name. She took short walks through the neighborhood near the hotel, mapping out the area like someone preparing an escape route. And each night, she opened her laptop and searched for work. Project management jobs were scarce in a town like Ashridge. Most listings required relocation or a local network. She couldn't afford either. But then, on the 4th morning, while sipping lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup, she found it. Administrative assistant needed. Mountain View Veterinary Clinic. Immediate start, flexible hours, entry level. It was well below her pay grade. The position required no degree, no resume boasting high-profile clients or project rollouts. But that was exactly the point. She didn't want to be found. Not yet. She arrived at the clinic 10 minutes early. It was a single-story building with wide windows and a garden of daffodils blooming stubbornly in the early spring chill. A wooden sign out front read, Mountain View Veterinary. Compassion. Care. Community. Claire adjusted her cardigan, draped carefully over her blouse, and stepped inside. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender pet shampoo. Classical music played softly from overhead speakers, and a golden retriever lay patiently at his owner's feet near the front desk. The receptionist looked up, her hair silver and coiled into a bun, eyes the kind that had seen enough to skip pleasantries but still knew kindness when it mattered. "Can I help you, dear?" the woman asked. "I'm here about the assistant position," Claire said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Oh, wonderful," the woman replied, smiling. "I'm Martha. Dr. Brooks is between appointments. I'll grab him for you. Take a seat if you'd like." Claire sat on the edge of a plush chair, trying not to look nervous. She didn't want to draw attention to herself. She just needed work. Something quiet. Predictable. Moments later, a tall man in a white coat stepped through the hallway. His sleeves were rolled up, and a few stray dog hairs clung to his pant legs. He looked more like a man who belonged in a workshop than a medical office. Broad shoulders, clean-shaven head, and calm eyes that flicked toward her without judgment. "Dr. Brooks," he said, extending his hand. "Samuel." "Claire," she replied, shaking it. "Let's talk in my office?" She nodded and followed him down the hall. The office was functional. Bookshelves lined with veterinary journals, a desk scattered with folders, and a cracked mug of what might have once been tea. There were no photos. No signs of a family or a life beyond work. That comforted her more than she cared to admit. He sat and gestured for her to do the same. "Tell me about your background." "I've done scheduling, calendar coordination, phone management," she replied, keeping her tone neutral, practiced. "I'm new in town and looking for something stable." He nodded slowly, clearly reading between the lines, but not pushing. "Veterinary software experience?" "No," she admitted, "but I'm a fast learner." "I believe that," he said. "You look like someone who knows how to keep things from falling apart." Claire wasn't sure how to take that. She simply nodded. He leaned back in his chair. "You can start tomorrow?" She hesitated for half a second before saying, "Yes, absolutely." "Good. Martha will show you around. We start at 8. That night in her hotel room, Claire didn't feel the usual edge of panic that had settled into her chest since Charleston. She ordered soup and crackers from the diner next door and opened her laptop, not to job search this time, but to look at rental listings in town. The prices were modest. Her savings would stretch if she was careful. She created a new email address, one that carried no trace of Wakefield, no history, no baggage. Her hand found her stomach again, more out of instinct than intention. "We're okay?" she whispered. It wasn't quite a lie. Not anymore. Over the next 2 weeks, Claire fell into a routine that felt like armor. She arrived at the clinic at 7:45 every morning. She learned the software quickly, kept her answers short, and kept to herself. The baggy cardigan she wore each day hid the subtle curve that hadn't been there a month ago. Samuel didn't pry. He gave her tasks and trusted her to complete them. Martha became a quiet source of comfort, always offering tea when the nausea crept in or sliding crackers her way without comment. Even the animals, in their strange, gentle way, seemed to sense that she was someone holding herself together by invisible strings. And then there was the boy. She met him on a rainy Thursday. The clinic was quiet, save for the soft tapping of paws and raindrops against the glass. A German shepherd barked suddenly at the front desk, startling Claire as she updated appointment logs. When she looked up, she saw a boy, no more than 8, clutching tightly to Samuel's leg, his hands clamped over his ears. "It's okay, Eli," Samuel said gently, crouching beside him. "Just breathe. Remember how we practiced?" Claire watched, frozen, as the child nodded, mimicking Samuel's slow, rhythmic breathing. The fear slowly drained from his face, replaced by concentration. The dog stopped barking. The room quieted. Later, Samuel passed by her desk. "My usual sitter canceled," he said. "School's out for teacher training." Claire didn't say much, just nodded. But her heart ached a little. The way he handled his son, with patience, with steadiness, it was the kind of parenting Richard had always spoken about with grandeur, but never modeled. That night, Claire sat alone in her car during her break, sipping ginger tea that Martha had left on her windowsill. The news alert on her phone showed a headline that made her stomach turn. "Charleston heiress vanishes on wedding day. Family offers reward." The article called her unstable, speculated that she'd had a breakdown. Not a single word mentioned what she'd seen. Claire locked the screen and leaned back in the seat, the warm tea burning her tongue. She didn't cry, but her throat tightened. When she returned to her desk, a small paper crane sat beside her keyboard. The folds were uneven, the wings slightly lopsided, but it was deliberate, carefully made. A note lay beneath it in a child's scrawl. "Mom used to make these when she was sad. Maybe it'll help you too." Claire stared at the crane for a long time, her hand trembling as she picked it up. She didn't know how Eli had known, but somehow he had. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. Not healed, not yet, but softened, like paper, ready to fold into something new. 3 weeks into her new life, Claire Harwood had become a master of silence. Her days at the Mountain View Veterinary Clinic passed in a rhythm that was almost meditative. Appointments filed, phone calls answered, invoices sorted with precision that never slipped. Every smile was polite, every movement efficient. Her growing belly, still hidden beneath a series of oversized cardigans, felt like a small, sacred secret, something untouched by the mess she'd left behind. But even silence has its limits. It started with the certified letter. Claire recognized the law firm's insignia before she even opened the envelope. Wakefield and Trent, the same firm that had drafted the prenuptial agreement. The same logo printed on their wedding invitations. Her fingers trembled slightly as she slit the top, heart hammering before her eyes even scanned the words. Custody of unborn child, immediate legal response required. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Richard was trying to claim parental rights. He'd filed for custody of a child who hadn't even drawn breath. And worse, he was portraying himself as a concerned husband, a victim of a pregnant woman's instability. Claire's stomach lurched, not from nausea, from fury. She sat frozen in the break room, napkin clenched in one hand, her tea untouched. Outside the window, the mountains stood stoic and still, as if to mock the storm building inside her. She had run, she had hidden, but now the past had followed her, dressed in tailored arguments and polished legalese. "Everything okay?" Samuel's voice caught her off guard. Claire looked up, too startled to respond quickly. He stood in the doorway, holding a clipboard, but his eyes weren't on the paperwork. They were on her, steady, watchful, kind. "I'm fine," she lied, the napkin crumpling further in her hand. He didn't press. Just nodded, the way someone does when they know the truth but won't take it until you're ready to hand it over. That evening, Claire returned to her small rental apartment and pulled the blinds tight. Her new phone buzzed, unknown number. She let it ring out, let the voicemail fill. Seconds later, another call. This time, she answered without thinking. "Claire," came the voice, smooth and familiar. "Richard." She froze. "Please don't hang up," he said quickly. "Everyone's worried, your parents, your friends." "I'm not coming back," she said, her voice hoarse. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears. "You're pregnant," he said, and the words hit like a slap. "Claire, this isn't you. Whatever this is, we can fix it. The hormones." She ended the call. Her hands shook as she powered the phone down and dropped it into a drawer. How had he known? She hadn't told a soul outside of Charleston, not even here, not even Samuel, not Martha, no one. She leaned over the bathroom sink, the porcelain cool under her palms, and stared at her reflection. Her eyes looked darker in this light, haunted. The cardigan hung looser than usual around her shoulders, but her stomach, it wasn't hiding so easily anymore. Someone knew. The next morning she came to work early, hands buried in her pockets, chin tucked down. She didn't want to meet anyone's eyes, not after the phone call, not after the fear. But when she walked into the reception area, she found a gift waiting. A cup of ginger tea, warm and fragrant, sat on her desk. Martha appeared a second later, arms crossed but smile soft. "Helps with morning sickness," she said gently. Claire didn't move. "I've had 3 kids," Martha added. "Takes more than a cardigan to fool these old eyes. Don't worry, sweetheart, your secret's safe." Claire blinked rapidly, nodding. She couldn't speak, her throat was too full. That afternoon, while filing patient records, she overheard voices from the break room. Eli and Samuel. "Why does Miss Claire always eat lunch in her car?" Eli asked. "Some people need quiet time," Samuel replied, his tone patient. "Like how you sometimes need your headphones." "But doesn't she get lonely?" "Sometimes," Samuel said after a pause. "People carry invisible walls, buddy. We respect them until they're ready to let us in." Claire stood frozen, a file halfway into the drawer. The simplicity of the words cut deeper than anything she'd read in Richard's letter. Walls. She had built them carefully, brick by careful brick. But here, in this quiet place with its origami dragons and ginger tea, people weren't trying to break them down. They were just waiting, gently. Later that day, she returned to her desk and found something new beside the crane Eli had given her. A second figure, folded from bright blue paper, an origami fox. A note scribbled underneath in childish handwriting read, "Some animals are shy, but they're still brave, like you." Her breath hitched. She placed the fox next to the crane on her desk. Not decorations now, guardians. That night, the loneliness crept back in. She sat on her bed, laptop open, staring at the news articles piling up online. Richard's team had gone public. Stories spun of a runaway bride, concern for mental health, whispers of instability. The comment sections were a toxic flood. Claire clicked through one headline after another until her chest tightened. She closed the laptop and grabbed her coat. Outside, the April moon hung low and yellow over the hills. She walked behind the clinic, into the small garden where the recovering animals sometimes wandered. A bench sat under a tree beginning to bloom, its petals catching moonlight like falling stars. She sat. Minutes later, footsteps crunched softly behind her. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. "My wife used to come out here too," Samuel said, his voice low. Said the lavender helped clear her head. Claire swallowed hard. "I didn't know you were married." "Anna," he said, settling on the bench but not too close. "She passed 3 years ago. Car accident. Eli was 5. "I'm sorry," Claire whispered, and she meant it. "She'd have liked you," he said. "Said some scars need air to heal." Claire closed her eyes. The tears were close, too close. "My scars are still bleeding," she admitted. "That's okay," he said quietly. "Bleeding means you're still alive." They sat in silence after that, the night cool but not unfriendly. The next day, Claire filed insurance claims like nothing had happened. But her mind wouldn't settle. The phone in the drawer stayed off, but the fear still clung. Richard had found her once. He could find her again. Her life felt thin, like paper stretched too far. As she packed up for the day, Samuel approached. "About tomorrow," he said, handing her a card. "Eli and I do pizza Fridays. He wants to show you his new origami animals, no pressure." Claire stared at the card long after he walked away. In her other hand, she held her phone. Trevor's number still burned into the screen, waiting. 2 invitations, 2 very different futures, and only one of them felt like a choice she was making for herself. Friday evening arrived with a quiet sense of anticipation Claire hadn't felt in months. She stood outside the modest 2-story home on Chestnut Lane, a paper bag in one hand, her other palm resting unconsciously over her belly. Inside, through the front window, she could see Eli setting something up on the coffee table, probably his origami supplies. The soft hum of life behind that window felt so inviting, so foreign, that Claire wasn't sure whether to knock or run. Her phone buzzed again, a text from Richard. "You're tearing this family apart. Your parents are devastated. Be reasonable." She turned the screen off without reading further and dropped the phone into the glove compartment with a decisive click. Then she stepped out into the crisp twilight and walked up the front path. The porch light flicked on automatically, illuminating the faded welcome mat and a row of tiny paper creatures lining the windowsill like sentinels. Before she could raise her hand to knock, the door swung open. "You came." Eli's eyes lit up with a joy so unfiltered it made Claire's breath catch. "Dad, Miss Claire came." Samuel appeared behind his son, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt instead of his usual clinic coat. The sight of him like this, comfortable, grounded, settled something inside her. "Eli," he said gently, "remember what we talked about with personal space?" The boy stepped back, sheepish but still grinning. Claire smiled, holding up the bag. "I brought salad, peace offering." "For the pizza?" Samuel asked, amused. "We accept." Inside, the house was a mixture of order and warmth. Medical journals sat stacked next to children's books. A calendar near the kitchen mapped Eli's routines in different colored markers. There was evidence of careful structure, but nothing felt rigid or performative. It was a home, not a showroom. Not like the house she'd shared with Richard, where everything had its place but nothing felt lived in. "Pizza's almost ready," Samuel said as he moved toward the kitchen. "Eli's been folding dragons all week. He's very excited." "Origami dragons?" Claire raised an eyebrow at Eli, who beamed. "They're guardians," he explained seriously, pointing at a half-finished creation. "Dad says they keep bad dreams away." Claire sat on the couch as Eli launched into an elaborate explanation of how he was trying to fold a 3-headed dragon. His hands moved with confidence, the paper rustling softly between his fingers. "Dad's not good at it," Eli added matter-of-factly. "His fingers are too big." I have other talents, Samuel called from the kitchen, like not burning the dinner, usually. Claire laughed, surprised at the ease of it. The sound felt new in her throat, like a melody she hadn't sung in years. They ate together around the kitchen island, pepperoni pizza, her salad, and root beer in mismatched glasses. Eli dominated the conversation. He had talking about animals at the clinic, the different kinds of paper folds, and a class project he was nervous about. Samuel guided him when he drifted too far off topic, but never shut him down. Their communication was a kind of dance, subtle and practiced, built on respect. As they cleared the table, Eli turned to Claire suddenly. "Why do you always wear those big sweaters?" he asked innocently. "Even when it's warm?" Samuel moved to redirect his son, but Claire held up a hand. Something inside her said it was time. "I'm going to have a baby," she said quietly. Eli's eyes went wide. "Really? Will the baby like origami too? Can we teach them?" Samuel chuckled softly, but Claire saw the flicker of something more in his eyes. Surprise, but not judgment. Maybe even a touch of admiration. "I don't know if babies are great at folding paper right away," she said with a smile, "but maybe someday." The conversation shifted after that, but something had changed. A wall had cracked, and instead of crumbling, it let the light in. After dinner, while Eli showed her his collection of paper creatures, Samuel tidied the kitchen. Claire watched him move, steady, present, grounded. He caught her watching and gave her a small, knowing smile. It wasn't flirtatious or demanding. It simply acknowledged her, as she was, without expectation. When it was time to leave, Eli handed her a carefully folded cat made of gold paper. "For the baby," he said seriously. "Cats are lucky." Claire held the little figure close as she stepped back out into the cool night air. She tucked it beside the blue fox and the original crane on her dashboard. They lined up like an unlikely army, watching over her. She didn't check her phone as she drove home. She didn't want to. The next morning, she arrived at the clinic early, energized in a way she hadn't felt in weeks. She filed paperwork, returned emails, and even smiled when Martha teased her about the pizza. But then Martha entered with a tablet in hand, her expression pinched. "Claire, dear, you need to see this." Claire took the tablet and read the headline. "Prominent businessman files for custody of unborn child, cites wife's emotional instability." Her blood ran cold. The article was filled with half-truths and manipulations. It described her as confused, overwhelmed, possibly dealing with depression. It portrayed Richard as the concerned husband desperate to protect his unborn child. There were even comments from friends of the family, suggesting she had a history of anxiety. Claire closed the browser quickly, but not before Samuel saw it over her shoulder. "My office," he said softly. Eli sat in the corner of the office with headphones on, absorbed in a game on his tablet. Samuel leaned against his desk, folding his arms. "How much trouble are you in?" he asked, not unkindly. "I don't know," Claire admitted, her throat tight. "He has lawyers, power, money, and I have," she trailed off. Samuel nodded slowly. "Do you have a lawyer?" "I can't afford the kind I'd need to fight him," she said. "He'll bury me in paperwork before I even get a court date." He reached for his phone. "I know someone." "Samuel, my sister-in-law," he said firmly. "Family court attorney. She's sharp. She'll know what to do." Claire wanted to argue, but she was tired. Tired of running. Tired of hiding. She nodded. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Samuel met her gaze with the same steady calm she was beginning to rely on. "Because I know good people when I see them," he said. "You work hard. You're kind. You make my son feel safe. That's enough." Claire blinked rapidly as a lump formed in her throat. She turned slightly, trying to hide the tears building. Eli noticed anyway. He removed his headphones and crossed the room with his origami book. "When I'm sad," he said simply, "I make birds. Dad says it helps." He placed the book in her lap, then sat beside her without saying another word. Claire looked at Samuel, who nodded. So she folded. With trembling hands and tear-filled eyes, she took the paper and began to create something. Anything. Each crease steadied her breath. Each fold pushed back the fear. When the crane was finished, she held it close, not as a symbol of escape, but of something new. Maybe strength wasn't about never breaking. Maybe it was about choosing to build again, piece by fragile piece. The courthouse loomed like a stone fortress against the gray morning sky, casting long shadows across the steps as Claire stood just outside its doors. Her palms were damp despite the cool breeze brushing her face, and her breath clouded slightly in the early air. The butterflies in her stomach had nothing to do with nerves, and everything to do with the tiny life nestled under her cardigan, fluttering gently against her ribs. Her daughter, Grace, she'd started calling her in her thoughts, seemed to know this day mattered. Beside her, Caroline Grant. The family court attorney Samuel had insisted she speak to, stood calm, polished, and radiating focus. Her tailored navy suit made her look like she belonged in a bigger courtroom than this small-town building. Her sharp eyes scanned the square, but her voice was soft as she said, "Let them show their cards first, Claire. We'll respond with facts, not panic." Claire nodded, her lips too dry to speak. On a bench just to the side of the courthouse doors, Samuel sat with Eli, who was folding paper with quiet determination. His hands worked quickly, creasing wings into a crimson phoenix. Eli's eyes flicked up just once, and he offered Claire a shy smile, one filled with a kind of quiet bravery that steadied her more than any legal briefing could. Inside, the courtroom was all polished wood and hushed tones. Trevor Wakefield was already seated with his team of high-dollar attorneys, each of them in crisp suits and expressions sharpened for battle. He looked immaculate, of course, every hair in place, tie perfectly knotted. But Claire noticed the fray at the edge of his sleeves, the faint dark circles under his eyes. For the first time he looked human, not monstrous, not invincible, just a man losing control. Judge Catherine Monroe entered and took her seat with an authority that silenced the room without a word. In her 60s, stern-faced and razor-sharp, she wasted no time. "Before we begin," she said, her voice cool and clear, "I want to express concern about the public nature of this dispute. Mr. Wakefield, your public statements have drawn attention to what should be a private matter. That alone warrants scrutiny." Trevor's lead attorney stood. "Your Honor, my client's actions were driven purely by concern for the well-being of his unborn child." Caroline rose smoothly, her tone measured but resolute. "We have documentation of 27 media appearances, 3 press releases, and multiple social media campaigns. This isn't concern, Your Honor. It's harassment." The judge nodded slowly and gestured for the hearing to begin. What followed was a tense, carefully choreographed exchange. Trevor's team presented their case with clinical detachment, painting Claire as unstable, erratic, and incapable of raising a child alone. They referenced her disappearance, the lack of communication with her family, her resignation from a high-powered job, her lack of current income. Claire sat still, absorbing each word like raindrops on stone, but her expression didn't crack. When it was Caroline's turn, the room shifted. "We'd like to enter into evidence financial records obtained from Mr. Wakefield's investment firm," she began. "They indicate a series of questionable transfers made shortly before and after my client's departure." "Objection," Trevor's lawyer barked. "This is a custody hearing, not a financial audit." Caroline didn't flinch. "These documents speak directly to Mr. Wakefield's character and his use of financial control as a means of coercion. It is relevant." The judge held up a hand. "Overruled. Continue." Caroline walked the court through a narrative that was far more than legal. It was personal. She pointed out inconsistencies in Trevor's version of events. She revealed the prenup clauses he had hoped Claire would forget. She brought forward an email, one he'd sent the day after Claire's departure, offering Alyssa, the bridesmaid, a position at his firm with a suspiciously high salary. And then Claire stood. Her knees wobbled for half a second before she steadied herself. The entire room waited as she faced the judge. "I found him with her," Claire said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "On our wedding night, in the bathroom of the suite where we were supposed to celebrate our vows. An hour earlier, he'd kissed me, talked about our future, about our child, and then he was with her." Trevor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For once, he had no rehearsed retort. Claire continued, her voice gaining strength. "He didn't chase me when I left. He didn't call. Not that night. Not the next day. What he's trying to protect isn't a child. It's an image. He wants control, not family." The judge leaned back, eyes locked on Claire. "And now?" she asked. "Now?" Claire took a deep breath. "I live in a small town. I work at a veterinary clinic. I'm surrounded by people who treat me with kindness and respect. I've found safety, dignity, and soon I'll have a daughter. And I won't let her grow up thinking love means control or fear." The room was silent. From the corner bench, a child's hand lifted something toward the glass. It was Eli, holding up the phoenix he'd folded earlier. Its wings caught the sunlight, casting a flickering shadow across the courtroom floor. The judge reviewed the documents for several long minutes, flipping through them slowly. When she looked up again, her voice was steady. Given the evidence, particularly Mr. Boson, Wakefield's attempts to manipulate the media and the serious concerns about his financial dealings, I am granting the divorce petition and awarding full custody of the unborn child to Miss Claire Harwood, pending further investigation into Mr. Wakefield's business activities. Trevor stood abruptly. This is absurd. Do you know who I am? Yes, Claire replied softly, turning to face him. That's the problem. The judge struck her gavel. Court adjourned. Outside the courthouse, Claire exhaled a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The air felt different now, lighter. Like something had been lifted off her shoulders, not just a legal weight, but a spiritual one. Samuel approached, Eli in tow, still clutching the phoenix. You did it, he said. Claire nodded. She didn't have words, only tears, relief pouring down her cheeks in hot, silent streams. Caroline appeared beside her. There'll be more legal proceedings regarding the financial fraud, she said. But the hardest part is done. Claire nodded again. Her hand found her belly. We're free, she whispered. This time the words held no question, only truth. 3 months after the courtroom victory, life no longer felt like a battle. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't easy, but for the first time in what felt like years, Claire Harwood could breathe without fearing who might be watching. Her days at the Mountain View Veterinary Clinic were filled with the sweet chaos of animal patients, appointment calendars, and paperwork. Ordinary things, the kind that grounded her more than she'd ever expected. On the days when the world felt heavy, Claire would retreat to the small garden behind the clinic. The same bench under the blooming tree had become her sanctuary. She often sat there with her newborn daughter, Grace, tucked into her arms, a soft blanket wrapped around her tiny frame. Grace was only a few weeks old, but already her presence had reshaped the rhythm of Claire's life. Her eyes, green with hints of hazel, were wide with curiosity, and her grip, though small, was fierce. She never cried without reason, never fussed without purpose. Claire often joked, half seriously, that her daughter had been born with the quiet wisdom of an old soul. Eli was enchanted. From the moment he met Grace, he declared himself her guardian. He'd folded a dozen new paper animals for her crib mobile, cranes, cats, even a giraffe with a slightly crooked neck. The mobile spun slowly in the breeze from Claire's open window, casting dancing shadows on the nursery wall. Grace seemed to recognize the shapes, her eyes following them with wonder. You know she's not going to be able to fold those herself for a while, right? Claire had teased one afternoon as Eli presented his newest creation, a silver fox with blue-tipped ears. She doesn't have to, he replied solemnly. She just has to look at them and feel safe. Samuel had stood nearby, listening with a quiet smile. He didn't say much in those moments, but his presence, solid, steady, was becoming something Claire had grown to rely on more than she liked to admit. He didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer, and he never filled silences with unnecessary words. Instead, he showed up, with food, with help, with the kind of support that never asked for anything in return. He'd even built a small changing table for Grace, carved from reclaimed wood and finished with soft, rounded edges. When Claire asked him why he'd gone to the trouble, he just shrugged. I had the materials, he said simply, and the time. But Claire knew better. She was beginning to learn the language of Samuel Brooks, the unspoken way he expressed care through action, the way he showed love by creating space for it to grow, without forcing it. One evening, after the clinic had closed and Eli was helping her clean up the waiting area, Claire caught Samuel watching them through the glass office door. There was something in his gaze, something thoughtful, almost uncertain. When Eli dashed off to wash his hands, Samuel approached. You know, he began, slipping his hands into his pockets, that house on Maple Street, the one with the big backyard and the window seat. You mentioned it once, back in March. Claire tilted her head. I remember. It's still for sale, he said, voice careful. You and Grace, you deserve more than that apartment above the bakery. It's a good place, but it's temporary. You could have something solid. She studied him, her heartbeat quickening. This wasn't just about real estate. "And what would that look like?" she asked softly. His eyes didn't waver. "It looked like dinners that aren't just Friday night. It looked like Eli having a little sister across the hall. You and Grace with a garden to plant in the spring. Me, where I'm already happiest, close enough to help, but never too close to crowd you." Claire didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for Grace's blanket, tucking it tighter around her daughter as she slept in her portable crib beside the reception desk. "I'm still figuring out who I am without all the damage," she said. "I can't promise I'm ready." "You don't have to promise anything," Samuel replied. "Just think about it." That night, Claire lay awake, listening to Grace breathe. The baby's soft exhales were like a lullaby, steady and grounding. She stared at the ceiling, watching the moonlight trace shapes on the wall through the spinning paper mobile. She thought of the woman she'd been on that wedding night, dressed in white, unaware of the betrayal happening just down the hall. She thought of the long drive north, the paper crane Eli had folded for her, the courtroom where she'd found her voice again. And she thought of this moment, this tiny room filled with love and hope and quiet possibility. A few days later, she found herself back in the Maple Street neighborhood. Grace was bundled in her stroller, dozing as Claire walked slowly along the sidewalk. The house was still there, 2 stories of worn brick, a wide porch, and a garden overrun with late-blooming sunflowers. The window seat faced east. It would catch the morning sun. She stood on the sidewalk for a long time, hand on the stroller's handle, not moving. Then Eli's voice rang out behind her. "Dad said you might come look." Claire turned, startled, to find him standing at the edge of the driveway, holding another paper crane, this one yellow and green, folded with more care than usual. "He said we could plant a tree for Grace," Eli added, holding out the crane. "Right in the backyard, so it can grow while she grows." Claire's throat tightened. She knelt down to his level and accepted the crane, pressing it gently against her chest. "Would you help me pick where to plant it?" she asked. Eli beamed. "I already picked the spot." Samuel appeared at the top of the porch steps. He didn't say anything, just watched, hands in his pockets again, waiting, not for an answer, but for a choice freely made. Claire looked up at him, then back down at Grace, who stirred in her stroller and blinked up at the world. The breeze picked up, scattering leaves across the lawn. She stood, nodding slowly. "Okay," she whispered, and for the first time in a very long time, the word didn't feel like surrender. It felt like the start of something beautiful. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Claire stood on the porch of what would soon be her new home, holding Grace close, Eli dancing in the yard with his arms stretched wide. Samuel stepped beside her, his shoulder brushing gently against hers. "I'm not running anymore," Claire said, more to herself than to him. He looked at her. "I never thought you were." The wind carried the scent of new beginnings, fresh grass, wood smoke, warm soil. Claire closed her eyes and smiled. Hum. 5 years later, the house on Maple Street hummed with the kind of weekend chaos that felt like music to Claire's ears. Sunlight poured in through wide windows, spilling golden warmth across the hardwood floors. From nearly every corner of the home, paper cranes hung on threads, twirling gently in the spring breeze, casting flickering shadows like dancers caught mid-motion. They were more than decorations now. They were witnesses. Memories. A quiet, fluttering history of everything this home had become. At the kitchen table, 5-year-old Grace sat on her knees atop a cushion, her tongue poking slightly from the corner of her mouth in focused determination as she folded a piece of lavender origami paper. Her little fingers creased the paper with deliberate care, pausing every few seconds to glance at her older brother. "Like this?" she asked. Eli, now 13 and shooting up like a sunflower, leaned over to guide her. His voice was patient, his gestures steady, and his eyes, still wide and thoughtful, held the calm of someone who had lived through more than most kids his age. Almost. "Don't forget the second wing," he said, gently pressing her thumb into the right crease. "The trick is to fold it like it's breathing." Claire watched them from the doorway, her heart full. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, not wanting to interrupt whatever spell was being cast at that table. The scent of cinnamon waffles still lingered from breakfast, and the kitchen sink was full of sticky plates and syrup-soaked forks. The mess didn't bother her. This was the kind of mess she'd once prayed for. Proof of life, of laughter, of permanence. "Mom," Grace said proudly, holding up her newly folded crane. "This one's for your desk." Claire stepped into the room, brushing a kiss across the top of her daughter's dark curls. "It's perfect," she said, accepting the small bird. "My cranes were getting lonely." Outside in the backyard, early spring flowers swayed in the wind, and the garden Samuel had built with his own hands was starting to bloom again. The same yard where Eli had once planted a tree for Grace, marking the day Claire had said yes to this new life. That tree now stretched confidently toward the sky, its branches strong, its trunk rooted deep in soil they'd turned together. Samuel entered from the back door, wiping his hands on a towel. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and there was a smudge of dirt on his cheek. "Waffles were excellent," he said, kissing Claire on the temple as he passed. "But you've got a visitor coming in 10 minutes. Claire frowned. "I do?" He nodded toward a stack of flyers she'd left by the door. "First session of the new parent support group. You've got at least 3 moms confirmed." Right. What had started as origami therapy for Eli had grown beyond anything she imagined. A community initiative hosted weekly at the clinic and now expanded into sessions at their home for parents going through separation, grief, or simply trying to start again. It wasn't therapy, not officially, but it was healing all the same. Paper folding, shared stories, and the quiet presence of others who understood the weight of rebuilding a life. Claire moved toward the flyers, smoothing the top one with a small smile. "I forgot it was already April." "It's a good group," Samuel said. "And you're good at it." She shrugged, still not entirely comfortable with praise. "I just listen." "That's what most people need," he replied, handing her a warm mug of tea. "Someone who doesn't flinch when they talk." From the living room, Grace called out, "Daddy, my crane's flying." Claire's heart still fluttered when she heard that word, Daddy. Grace had said it for the first time the week after their wedding, a quiet ceremony in the backyard beneath strings of paper cranes and fairy lights. It had been simple, perfect, and with a kind of reverent peace that only comes when 2 people say yes after walking through fire. Samuel walked over and lifted Grace in his arms, spinning her gently before holding her close. "Flying cranes mean good luck," he told her, tapping the tip of her nose. "Then we must be the luckiest family ever," she giggled. Claire took a sip of tea and watched them together. The memory of her first wedding, stiff, perfect, performative, feeling like it belonged to another person entirely. Trevor Wakefield, now serving a federal sentence after the full scope of his financial crimes had unraveled, was little more than a shadow in the rearview mirror. Brushed away by the wind like ash, Bryn had turned state's evidence in the end, revealing everything Claire had once suspected and more. The media had gobbled up the scandal, the empire that collapsed behind the mask of prestige. But Claire had stopped reading those stories a long time ago. She had better things to fill her time with. Grace's laughter, Eli's new hobbies, Samuel's quiet reassurances, the small joys of community. She placed Grace's new crane on the shelf above her desk, next to the very first one Eli had ever given her. The wings of both birds faced outward, as if ready to lift off at any moment. As afternoon slipped toward evening, families began to arrive. Mothers with toddlers, a father with twins, a grandmother raising her granddaughter after a divorce. Claire welcomed them all with the ease of someone who understood the language of grief and hope alike. Paper and laughter filled the sunroom. Eli led the kids in folding simple animals, while Grace took charge of the glitter glue with bossy delight. Claire sat with a woman whose hands trembled as she tried to fold a basic crane. "I don't know if I can do this," the woman whispered. Claire smiled gently, guiding her fingers over the crease. "You already are." Later, when the sun had dipped low and the yard was dappled in warm amber light, Claire stood at the back door and looked out over the group. Parents talked in quiet circles, kids ran barefoot through the grass, and her daughter chased paper birds across the lawn with her older brother laughing behind her. Samuel stepped beside her and slipped his hand into hers, fingers interlacing with the ease of old rhythm. "You ever think about how far we've come?" he asked softly. Claire leaned her head against his shoulder. "All the time." "And?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her hair. She smiled. I think we're exactly where we're meant to be. Above them, a breeze stirred the line of paper cranes strung along the porch. They rustled softly, wings fluttering like a heartbeat, like memory, like the echo of a woman who once ran away in silence and now stood in the center of something stronger than any fairy tale. A life she chose, a family she built, a future she welcomed, and for the first time, it felt endless. Like flight. Thank you so much for staying with us through this story. If you've made it this far, it means you believe, like Claire, that even in the darkest moments, we can choose hope, healing, and a new beginning. This isn't just a story about betrayal or heartbreak. It's about the quiet courage it takes to walk away from what breaks you, and the strength it takes to build something better, with love, with patience, and with people who truly see you. Sometimes life forces us to let go of the picture-perfect plan so we can step into something real, something meaningful. Claire didn't just find a new life, she found a home, a family, and her voice. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know which part of the world you're joining us in this journey. Drop a comment and share your thoughts. We read every one. And if this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story that inspires, empowers, and reminds us all of what really matters. You are not alone. You are stronger than you think. We'll see you in the next video.